She has extensive experience with youth service and counseling, having begun a youth leadership program in a Milwaukee independent living center and taking the program from its inception to a fully funded youth service program with a staff of 5, serving more than 500 young people with disabilities annually. Dr. Kriofske Mainella is a nationally recognized sexual and relationship health educator for youth with and without disabilities and has vast experience developing and managing programs in youth service, mental health, and disability service. Dr. Kriofske Mainella is the chair of her department's Racial and Social Justice Committee and the lead instructor of the Counselor Education and Counseling Psychology Department's Multicultural Counseling course. She was raised by her parents to speak up for injustice and fight for change, a driving value in both her personal and professional life. Dr. Kriofske Mainella, we're so excited to have you join us today. Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Emily Lund, who is an associate professor of counselor education in the Department of Educational Studies and Psychology, Research, Methodology, and Counseling at the University of Alabama. Their research focuses on disabled and multiply marginalized people, with particular emphasis on interpersonal violence and trauma, suicide and non-suicidal self-injury, graduate education and training, and LGBTQ+ issues within those communities. They have published over 100 peer-reviewed publications, 2 edited books, and numerous book chapters. They are a non-binary person with a physical disability. And Dr. Lund, we're so excited to have you join us here as well. And last but certainly not least, we also have Dr. Tameeka Hunter, who is a licensed professional counselor, a nationally certified counselor, and a nationally certified rehabilitation counselor. She is a tenure-track assistant professor, an intersectional diversity and social justice scholar, a professional diversity speaker, and a researcher. Her research focuses on the resilience of marginalized and multiply marginalized populations, including people living with disabilities and chronic illnesses, people of color, sexual and gender expansive people, and women. Her work examines the impact of resilience and strength-based approaches on marginalized and multiply marginalized populations' psychosocial, educational, and vocational function. Dr. Hunter, we're also thrilled to have you join us here today. Dr. Kriofske Mainella, Dr. Lund, and Dr. Hunter, we're honored to have all 3 of you join us. And at this point, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for those wonderful introductions. Thank you all so much for joining us. So we will be talking about what we've entitled Disability at the Intersection and looking at disability, LGBTQIA+ pride, identity, and service. All 3 of us are very interested in this topic and excited to talk to you. Our learning objectives for you today include examining the intersection between disability, BIPOC, and LGBTQIA+ identities, to understand the application of Beatrice Wright's coping versus succumbing framework to affirmative identity development, and then to discuss disability justice and the ways in which LGBTQIA+ identity is rooted in the disability justice movement and how you can use it to serve individuals in this population. You heard about us, so I shall turn it over to Dr. Hunter.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. Very excited about the topic. I won't go through my bio because Daniel so graciously shared this information. So we'll move on to the next slide. So we're going to talk a bit about LGBTQIA+ identities at the intersections. So first, because I am a qualitative researcher, I think it's important for me to share my positionalities. I am endemic to my research. I share the identities of the populations that I serve and research. And so I identify as African American and Black, either one. I think it's very important for me to acknowledge my roots. So I also identify as African American. I am a cisgender woman. I have a lifelong physical disability. Shout out to all the CEEPs out there, CP people. I identify as queer as well. Prior to earning my doctorate, I had a 17-year career So I started when I was 2, as an accessibility services director. And now I am a tenure track faculty member, a multicultural rehabilitation counselor educator. Say that 3 times fast. And tenure track at Palo Alto University. However, it's a remote role, so I'm physically located back in my home state of Georgia. So, because we're talking Happy Pride, by the way, since we're talking about LGBTQIA or queer history and perspectives, I think it's important to share some historical perspectives. So, Marsha P. Johnson, many credit Marsha P. Johnson, a Black trans woman, with throwing the first brick that sparked the uprising, right? And later she said that she did not get there until the clash was already underway. And so this is interesting to me to think about. Oh, by the way, the pronouns that I'm using are the ones that the individuals that we're talking about use, or so those will be the ones that I'm using in terms of pronouns. My own pronouns are she, her. So here I think this is interesting because it makes me think about, is there a question around safety so that we can't she didn't feel safe to claim? If that were the case, that she threw the first brick, then is it not safe for her to claim that action in that time period? And so later she said she didn't arrive until the clash was underway, or it could just simply be true that she did not arrive until the clash was underway. Um, Sylvia Rivera. Other stories have said that Sylvia Rivera, a Latina and Black trans woman, threw up the first Molotov cocktail. So yet another kind of story about the origins of the Stonewall Uprising. And then last but not least, and there's some discussion around how she pronounced her name, but Storm LaValle said that as a Black biracial lesbian and drag king, that she sparked the resistance by throwing the first punch. She's very clear in saying that it was not a riot. I know it's often described as a riot, but she describes some historic interviews that it was an uprising, right? It was civil disobedience. So did not kind of shirked and balked at the description of it being a riot, right? But so there's this discussion around and some lack of clarity around how it started. But what we do know for certain is that BIPOC, trans, and queer folk were at the forefront of this movement. So, we don't have enough time to talk about, all of the systemic barriers that impact an intersectional population like queer identified disabled people. By the way, I use both identity first language, disabled person, and um, person first language, person with a disability, interchangeably, because they're both, it all depends on the person that you're referring to and what they prefer in terms of which terms we use. So I use those terms interchangeably. But just to note that, with an intersectional population like this, disabled, queer, identified people, there are systemic barriers. One, for example, is that typically white, cisgendered, able-bodied men are asked to lead LGBTQ plus initiatives and set priorities for the communities. And actual priorities for, say, a Black disabled trans woman are likely different, right? Because there's a need for survival. And so we're not going to have the same priorities. So it's not meant to be a pejorative statement about white, cisgender, able-bodied men. It's more that because of our cultural and other experiences, our priorities will be different, right? So for a Black disabled trans woman, the focus on survival is likely due to interlocking oppressions related to racism, ableism, transphobia, etc., right? And of course, as we know, systemic oppression can limit opportunities for employment, housing, transportation, and healthcare. So That's what we mean when we say it's systemic. It crosses all socioeconomic statuses and races, and that it's ingrained in the systems that exist. So it's pretty expansive. So just to, we're talking kind of big picture in terms of systemic barriers, but how does this show up when working with actual individuals and clients? So I co-authored a study, lead author on a study called Queering Disability in 2020. And as a qualitative researcher, my question was, what are your lived experiences as a person who is queer identified and has at least one or more disabling conditions? And so it was interesting because the question was just a broad, open-ended question, but what ended up, the results were dichotomous. So even though I didn't ask about resilience minimizers and maximizers, that is how the data bore out. So it was very dichotomous in terms of how they responded. And I would be remiss if I did not say and acknowledge, right, that resilience has some legitimate critiques, right? Certain communities are asked, like this one, are asked to be more resilient than others, right? The opportunity structures are not equal. But at the same time, I choose to study resilience and other strengths-based perspectives for two reasons. Resilience is thought to have health buffering effects. So it's similar to coping, but not the same. So coping is how you adapt to something that has already happened to you. So how do you adapt to a negative impact? With resilience, you can kind of buffer and not absorb the negative impact of what is happening. The other reason why I study strength-based perspectives with this population is because I have a critique of the field of counselor education, of counseling, of helping professions in general. We can kind of get into a what I call disparity porn. And yes, I did say porn. Perspective, because we choose, the editors choose what they publish, right? And we talk a lot about disparities. And don't get me wrong, disparity information is important. However, what is missing is balance in the literature, because in every community there are also strengths. So we don't want to always focus on the negative only, right? Because then we become like kind of the perpetuators of oppressive stereotypes, if that's what we focus on all the time. So I want to honor through my work and use it to inform my teaching, research, and service the strengths that are also in that community and try to bring some balance into the literature. So with this study, this participant is talking about something that minimizes their resilience. They feel less resilient as a result of these experiences. And the thematic code is fragmentation. This participant said, I experienced queer phobia from the disability community and ableism in the queer community. When I'm in disability spaces, people say, we're not talking about that gay stuff right now, just disability. When I'm in queer spaces, they're usually physically inaccessible. If a space is physically inaccessible, then I get stared at and asked, why are you here? Again, interlocking oppression. Another resilience minimizer is punishment. This participant, this was heart-wrenching in a way. This participant had this participant has since passed, but this participant had a chronic illness that was progressive and degenerative and life-threatening. And at a certain point, this person had to stop working and move back in with their parents because they were no longer to take care of their activities of daily living and take care of themselves. And in the course of that, let me just read this. Again, the thematic response is punishment. The parents of this person who was responsible for their care, found out that this person was in a same-sex relationship, and had been for several years before moving back home because they needed care. And basically, they said this: I can't be in a relationship or do any of these things because do I need help? Because I do need help, and I must choose. What would you choose? Would you choose being in a fulfilling relationship with someone you really care about? Or would you choose to be able to physically survive, to live? So in this case, the parent said, despite this participant's need for care and having a life-threatening condition, when they found out they were in a same-sex relationship, um, they said that you will not be able to live here despite your medical needs. You won't be able to live here. You have to end this relationship or you have to leave. So just think about that. So some of the implications and recommendations, I think this group is kind of like preaching to the choir, so to speak. Locations in Southern, so I have all kind of adages and stuff like that. But I know that this group likely knows that disability is simply another form of diversity, right? And that it's important to utilize the disability-related counseling competencies. And also, it's helpful when you're working with an intersectional population like this one to learn more about affirming intersectional approaches to supporting disabled LGBTQIA clients. In 1989, a Black woman, Kimberly Crenshaw, coined the term intersectionality, how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics such as ability status and sexual and gender expansiveness overlap to create interlocking oppressions. And she avers that these experiences are inextricably linked. And so they create a new set of experiences where the individual can't necessarily parse out whether racism, transphobia, homophobia, what is at play to even try to address the issue, because it creates the intersectional identities, and oppression actually creates this interlocking situation where it's a whole new set of experiences based on multiply marginalized identities. So one model that I want to share with you that's helpful in working with clients with intersecting identities is the affirmative intersectional rehab counseling model by Dispenza et al. 2016. Also, it's really important to assess the support system and respect that many members of the queer community have chosen family, right? So we have to sometimes our nuclear family might, as I talked about with this participant, might no longer want to support us and that sort of thing. And so we have other communities that we can build and choose to build, and those are chosen family, and that should be respected and regarded as other members of bio family. Also, it's important when we're talking about an intersectional population to recognize that coming out may not be safe or the goal. So the whole coming out phenomenon is, or approach to things, there's nothing wrong with that, but recognize that this is really a white Western male approach, able-bodied typically approach to things. So if you think about from the standpoint of someone who is a Black gay man with a disability, so the impact of racism can be used to help buffer the harms that are caused by ableism. So you learn how to like not internalize that through the help of your family potentially, and having that kinship bond in terms of navigating racism. It can help you navigate other forms of oppression. But the issue is so the idea of coming out may not be appropriate for everyone, simply because it might mean that you are ostracized by your family, told that you're going to go to hell and that it's a sin, and cut off all emotional, familial, and financial support. This is where we get into, particularly with the trans community, you see so much oppression and so much discrimination that there's survival sex that happens and risk-taking behaviors that really can lead to major health disparities and issues. And so I think it's really important to think about the client that's in front of you. Coming out may not be the safest thing to do, and that, create the space where it is okay to for them not to come out, because I'm sure that they understand and know their reasons for doing that. And that's something just to remember, that's not a generally applied thing. It doesn't work for every client or every situation. It truly put them in a situation where harm can be caused. So in terms of research and conducting research in a culturally responsive, culturally humble way, one of the things you can do is to avoid the majority to minoritized group comparisons. So we love to do this in our field, right? We love to do that. But think about it. So when you set that up, it's automatically, when you compare the majority to a minoritized group, it's going to be a disparity. It's going to be a kind of like a discrepancy kind of model. And that's not the best way in terms of doing research in a culturally responsive way. So one of the things you can do is conduct studies that examine within group differences. So you could study a group of LGBTQIA plus individuals with disabilities, and then examine the differences among the group, within the group. So, and this also is helpful to add to the literature base, because it addresses the disability as a monolith myth, right? And so looking at those differences within the group is really helpful to strengthen that body of knowledge, because we have a lot of research already available that's about majority to minoritized group comparisons. Also with your clients, if you're talking about in practice, inquire about the role of religion and spirituality. They may have a very strong sense of, their religious beliefs and spirituality, and it could be an avenue to help you support these clients, and also help them to process if they've been given the messaging that you can't be a spiritual or religious person if you are queer identified. That might be a nice place to be able to support clients in practice. In your practices also, it's important to include an inclusive language. Spouse, partner, don't use the word preferred when you're talking about pronouns. They're just your pronouns, just like they are with heterosexual people. They're just your pronouns. Also, again, this group I'm sure knows this, but ask about how disability impacts life rather than making negative assumptions. I'm going to share something that happened with me. So I'm married, and I was looking for a couples counselor, right? So you can't see it, but I have a little small motorized wheelchair, a little chariot's right back here. So I go and I do the little consultation, but I do it in person. This is pre-COVID. So I roll in the chair, and the prospective counselor says, "Oh, well," after some pleasantries, "Oh, well, I see that you have a disability. I'm sure that's part of the reason you are here." That actually happened. True story. So so what that does is basically reveals a bias, right? That there's an assumption made that my disability is the reason that there's problems. And I hated to inform this person, but disability does not absolve you of spousal, familial, financial, sexual, and all other kinds of issues. I wish it did, but it doesn't. And so because that assumption was harm, it's a microaggression. And so it was really kind of an interesting experience to have that happen directly to me as someone who's also a clinician. And then assess the queer identity and disability identity development of your clients. What I found in the study also was that if the individual can be at different places on disability, chronic illness identity development, and sexual identity development. So that's important. There are some intersectional models of identity development, looking at both. So I think those are important to know about, and recognize that internalized stigma, ableism, and homophobia, those things, and we already talked about the need sometimes to conceal or not to come out.
So this provides a really nice segue into talking about Beatrice Wright and her coping versus succumbing and affirmative identity model. I think it's really important how Dr. Hunter talked about identity development. And so I'm hoping to touch on identity development and bring it into this context of Beatrice Wright. So I will share, Daniel gave a beautiful introduction, but one of the things I always like to share in my bio is that my parents raised me to be social justice activist. And I feel like that's a really strong part of my identity. And as our presentation is about intersectionality, we actually, when Dr. Lund and Dr. Hunter and I met a few times in our preparation, we talked a lot about like how we were using the word intersectional multiple times and in multiple ways. And as counselors, we know there's intersection. Of course, we know about Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, right? And that's how we think about identities. And today, in part, we're talking about the intersection of being a person who identifies LGBTQIA+ and being a person who has a disability. So that intersection. But as counselors, we focus on the intersectionality of concepts, and look at all the researchers out there who've created identity development models and concepts for serving clients that intersect with various areas. And later, Dr. Lund will talk about disability justice and the key component of intersectionality in that movement. And then there's the intersection that Dr. Hunter also mentioned of the importance of our competencies, and that we work to be trained and we understand different things, but we can't just lean on competency. We also have to be humble. And we can't lean on being humble either, right? Like we can't just say, well, I'm just going to be open and non-assumptive about everything, and I'm not going to learn about some histories of, communities I'm serving and some of what's happened in our field, and the way that in many ways our field of counseling was rooted in the field of psychology, which is part of our white supremacist system in our United States. So we have to learn about these things, and also, so there's so many intersectionalities. And so I say that in part to just further my introduction. I think a lot about identity because I have a lot of very visible privileged identities. I'm a white person, I'm a cisgendered woman, I'm teaching in academia, so I have, that brought me here so much demographic privilege. But I also have my own identities that are deeply held, and we also have identities that are politicized, right? And so I rarely share that I'm a person who identifies as someone with a disability. I have hearing impairments, I wear hearing aid, but it's not visible to people unless I put my hair up. And sometimes I purposefully put my hair up so people can see that I wear hearing aids. And I do that in different spaces, in part when I'm in, a lot of the disability justice spaces I'm in. I want people to see something visible about me. But I think about my father, who's older and probably needs a hearing aid, who's fearful of wearing that visible symbol of disability for fear of the marginalization he'll experience, right? So there's so much intersectionality. And I also identify as bisexual, but I'm married to a man, so I have all the privilege of a straight person. So I rarely share that piece of my identity unless it's really makes sense to share, or it's in a very personal context, because I'm certainly not going to share it to act like I understand what it's like to have your relationship marginalized, because mine isn't. So all that to say, I think it's so important, and I appreciate so much Dr. Hunter's sort of qualitative description of the positionality that she holds in this space. And I know that Dr. Lund will also share their same sort of positionality, but I think it's really, it just shows up in really important ways. So I want to thank my colleagues for inspiring me to think that way. So Beatrice Wright. Beatrice Wright is, and well, was a revolutionary force in our field. She was way ahead of her time in how disability was, how she thought about disability in terms of how disability was thought about in the 1960s when she first wrote her book, Physical Disability, A Psychological Approach. She discussed disability. I would venture she's one of the first people to really publicly, in a research and professional way, talk about disability not as a personal problem, but as a social problem. We always, in our field, you know, I know that, you know, likely those of you who are here today are either rehab counselors or you're in the rehab field or you care about this topic. And we know already that disability is a social problem. We all, many of us, I'm sure, have talked a lot about the medical model versus the social model. But Beatrice Wright really brought that into knowing in our field. She wrote a second edition of her book in 1980, A Physical Disability, A Psychosocial Approach. And so I want to talk a little bit about her theory and how we can apply it to our work in the field, to our advocacy. If you're working with clients or you're an advocate or you're a person who holds identities, how can you apply this to what you do and what you care about? So Kurt Lewin developed the sort of what's called field theory, and it's the idea, and again, this is a very old theory that you can see in some ways where a lot of our work in sort of just looking at the socio-demographic realities of people. I don't know a lot about Kurt Lewin's personal life. I'm guessing he wouldn't have necessarily thought about socio-demographic realities that we think about today, or that the three of us on this presenter list might be thinking about. But I love the way we can in our field look at some of these foundational theories that may not have been intended to be used the way we use them now, but they're so applicable. And so field theory is the idea, right, that we have a person who may be experiencing some sort of a barrier towards the goal they're reaching, but it's not just about the person, it's about their environment and their life space, right? And so we know that when you are, you know, as Dr. Hunter really like aptly put, that a white cisgendered queer male is going to come in with a different idea of what the barriers are and what their environment might be than a Black trans disabled woman, right? And so and on and on and on, right? Like we know there are endless identities and intersecting identities that people can have, but Beatrice Wright looked at this idea of field theory and thought about the way a person times their environment is really what we should be looking at. Not just like, oh, this person uses a wheelchair, they have a problem, right? This person has all these pieces of their environment, plus this place is not accessible for their wheelchair, right? And so, excuse me. So Beatrice Wright had a couple of wonderful pieces of theory that she used to really think about field theory first. So one of the things that she talked about was coping. So when an individual has a disability, they have to cope. It maybe they have to cope with some of the physical or the psychological or the sensory impacts of their disability, but it also is often the case that what they're really having to cope with is the way the world is not set up for them. And so coping can be, we all, you know, many of us probably think about coping in terms of how there's so much research, which is outside the scope of our presentation, but there's a ton of work done on what coping is and how people cope and whether they cope actively or they cope passively and how those things work for coping. But Beatrice Wright talked about coping and how it's really important to note that there are variables that influence coping. And those variables are including, but not limited to, our age, our disability, whether it's congenital or acquired, if it's acquired, how old were we when we acquired the disability, how our disability impacts us in terms of functional limitations. Do we experience pain that goes along with our disability? Do we experience pain in general because of something else? And what is the nature of our life and our stressors that we are working to cope with, right? And so I think Dr. Hunter's example is really great, is that you may be going in for couples therapy because you're coping with, wanting to have a healthy relationship with a partner, and you have a therapist who's assuming that you're coping with what they can see about you. It's like astounding to me how people just assume. My daughter, this is my sidebar. My daughter went to see a therapist to deal with some anxiety, and she had dyed her hair, and the therapist said, "Did you dye your hair at home in your bedroom, your bathroom, or your parents' bathroom?" And my daughter was so offended that there was just an assumption that we even had more than one bathroom, which we don't, that she was like, "I don't want to go back." So I think it speaks to the importance of not making assumptions, but really we're all going to have the assumptions, but to check those assumptions at the door. And I might think like, "Oh, I see you have this physical disability," but I'm not going to say like, "Oh, it must be." I'm going to say, "Tell me why you're here." And we can always open our questions up more and more, right? So that's one of the things Beatrice Wright talked about with coping. The other thing, and I'll get into a little bit more about coping versus succumbing, but one of the things she did lay out in terms of theory was the idea of adjustment to disability. And so Beatrice Wright talked about her sort of 4 big ways in which people may adjust to a disability. And this can happen whether you were born with a disability or you acquire a disability. So the first is that there's this idea of enlarging the scope of values. So we live in a society that is set up for privilege. When I notice all the time when I teach my students and I look at textbooks, it always seems to assume that the audience is white when we're talking about race, right? If we're talking about being more affirmative to LGBTQIA people, it's always assumed that the audience is straight and cisgender. Like, we are set up in a way that just caters to the privileged among us. And Beatrice Wright talked about the ways in which we have these sort of comparative asset values. We watch TV, we see who's represented, who's seen as attractive, who's seen as having relationships, who's seen as the sort of norm. And if you have a disability, particularly a physical disability, you may find yourself comparing yourself to others. And so one of the stages of adjustment that Wright talks about is that you're enlarging your scope of values to asset values rather than comparative values. What do I have to give, right? So I have a really good friend who acquired a spinal cord injury, and he acquired that injury at 18. So he was, pretty grown, and became a man who used a wheelchair. And after, of course, going through a period of grief and healing and all that he had to do, he now will describe like ways in which, not certainly that entirely, but ways in which his life is better now because of some of what he's gained, that he's seen some asset values and something that he's gained. And in part, he works with kids with disabilities, so that's really meaningful to him. I'm not saying that anyone who's ever had a spinal cord injury will feel that way, but that's just an example of sort of not comparative values, but asset values. What do I have to give? Another one is the subordination of the physique. So that's her second piece of adjustment to disability, which again is, I find it less valuable the package I come in rather than what I have to give as a human. We talk about this in terms of many things in the counseling world. I talk about this in terms of self-esteem and body image. But Beatrice Wright really talked about it in terms of disability, particularly physical disability, that you can say, yeah, this is the package I come in, but I also have, so maybe I can't get into your restaurant, or maybe I can't read the print on your slides, or maybe I can't hear you say something verbally, but I have accommodations and I have other things. So the subordination of the physique. The third is the containment of the effect of disability. So we can contain the impact of disability through various other factors. So it could be our personality, it could be our job, it could be other privileges we hold, it could be how very attractive we are, it could be any number of things that can help us contain the impact of our disability. It could be, for many people, it's getting involved in disability rights and having a community of people around you that really does contain the impact of your disability because you feel a sense of belonging in a community, right? And so again, these are just examples, but this is the way that Beatrice Wright talked about the containment of the effect of disability, among other things. And so I talked about the values, so enlarging your scope, and then of course I already talked about comparative to asset values. And so we often, and so my friend I told you about who acquired a spinal cord injury, he enlarged his scope of values. His life became a very different life than it was pre his spinal cord injury, but it enlarged his value system where he still held the same values that he had before injury, but enlarged them to a new career, a new way of living. And so that's her adjustment to disability in a nutshell. There's so much more you could write papers and papers, and I know people have written papers and papers about this, but I think it's kind of worth thinking about as we think about coping and then the way we apply this to identity development and disability justice and LGBTQIA plus justice. So again, I won't go on and on about this, and for some it might be difficult to see. But of course, when you look at psychosocial adaptation to disability and chronic illness, again, this is just a lovely photograph of the ways in which we have demographic characteristics that impact the way that we are treated and seen and given services and looked at by others in the world. And then we have our related variables to our chronic illness or disability, which is again, onset, pain, type, severity, symptoms, functional limitation, right? So I have a hearing impairment, and when I wear my hearing aids, that is corrected. So I don't experience a lack of access to things. Now, when I'm at home and the TV's on and people are sleeping, then I turn subtitles on because I can't hear the volume when it's low, but these are accommodations that you make. And if I, so yeah, so you see how that impacts it. Environmental factors then, of course, is the access that you have to things, the availability of resources, which includes knowing about resources, right? So if you come from different backgrounds, you may never have even known these resources, or if you acquire your disability later in life and you aren't connected to the disability community, you wouldn't know some of these resources. Attitudinal barriers is huge, right? The way people look at you, make assumptions about some of the characteristics they can see about you, and then further assumptions they make when you choose to share about yourself and your intersecting identities. And then, of course, social support, which we know in our field is highly, highly important. And then there's personality and psychological attributes. So do I have a present time orientation or a future time orientation? Is it it's a value of mine that everybody's on time? Or am I more interested in sort of living in the moment? It's a very sort of boiled down idea of time orientation. What are my coping strategies? Am I an optimist or a pessimist? So those things play into it. And then that all leads into our psychosocial outcomes, how we adjust, how satisfied we are with our life, the amount of distress we experience, our anxiety and depressive symptoms, self-esteem, self-concept, and our acceptance of who we are, which I think, and I'll show a little Venn diagram I made, but like our self-acceptance can be applied to any type of identity. But particularly we see a lot of literature about self-acceptance for people with disabilities and self-acceptance for people who identify as LGBTQIA+. So the coping versus succumbing model, Beatrice Wright talked about the ways in which we can cope with our disability or diagnosis, or, I mean, she wasn't looking at it this way, but I think you can also consider it in terms of if you are experiencing marginalization. I think we always have to be very careful because I don't think anyone wants to be seen as coping with who they are, but coping with the barriers you experience because of how people see you in terms of your identity. So you can cope with these issues, or you can succumb to them or succumb to the stress of them. And so in the coping versus succumbing model, coping is really emphasizing what your already existing positive attributes are, and looking at disability or a diagnosis or chronic illness as a difficulty to work with or overcome. I remember when I first got really involved in the disability rights field, I had a good friend who was a disability advocate who's since passed, and her daughter had pretty significant, she had multiple disabilities. And because in the disability rights and justice field, there is that sense of like community and togetherness and positivity. I remember her saying to me, you know, my daughter's disability sucked. It sucked for her. Like, it's still difficult, even though we experience this sense of disability pride and belonging. For me and my daughter, it's also difficult, right? And so Beatrice Wright was looking at it as, if you're coping, then you may see your disability as a difficulty, largely due to other barriers placed on you, not necessarily the disability itself, to overcome or work with. And succumbing, on the other hand, is when somebody's feeling really, just the emphasis is placed on their impairment, their disability, the disease, or the pathology. Now, again, like Dr. Hunter said earlier, we have to be careful, right? Some people are expected to have more resilience than others, and this is a good example of that. So if I'm working with a client for whom their disability is really forefront in their mind, and that is what they're struggling with, I cannot then, as a counselor, say, well, come on, you got to be positive. If you just were, that's not fair either, right? So that's, again, when you think about cultural humility, I can use my knowledge and my competency and what Beatrice Wright taught us about psychosocial adaptation, but then I also have to use my humility. And if I have a client who is saying, I am having a hard time because of my disability, then I have to say, well, then let's work on that together, right? So, and then the other piece of it, disability as an insufficiency that a person has in mind and body. And again, I spent my whole career in the disability rights movement, so it's really easy for me to be like, yay, we're disability community, it's great. But I might have a client who has a cultural or a familial value that has told them that disability is an insufficiency. And then I have to meet them there. And I can't say, well, that's not right, right? Even if I feel in my mind, right, that's where we go back into our code of ethics and our values bracketing. Even if I feel maybe even a little hurt by that, I have to say, okay, that's where you are, and I have to meet you there. But that's the framework of Beatrice Wright's coping versus succumbing model. So basically the questions are, when you're coping, you're asking, what can I do? What areas of life can I participate in? And if there's a place in which I can't participate, or I feel like there's a barrier, is there anything I can do? Or is there anyone I can go to? Or better yet, do I have an ally who might jump in and say, let's work on this together and see if we can't make sure that there's a way that you can access this so we can access it together. And then asking questions like, what do I love to do? What do I want to do? What's great about me? Taking an active role in your life. So that was the idea of coping, where succumbing may be what I can't do, what has happened to me, and a victim of my circumstance. Again, if you use a wheelchair and you are super excited to go to this new restaurant and there is not a way in for you because there's no ramp or there's steps or there's even a step, well, of course you're going to feel frustrated and sad about what you can't do and what has happened to you. You are going to feel like a victim of your circumstance. And there are many ways in which that makes a lot of sense, right? But Beatrice Wright was looking at that in terms of an overall way of looking at life. And this is how people can cope. Coping versus succumbing, again, Wright said, when you're coping, so when you think back to the asset values versus comparative values, when you have asset values, you're saying, if I accomplish something, it's because of me and what I did to make it happen, right? So think of all the people, for example, when you think about racial justice, who complain about affirmative action, right? And, oh, this person just got this job because of affirmative action. But truthfully, people get jobs because they are the best person to get the job, right? And so you can make the argument of, maybe, I might feel like I was the diversity hire, but I got this job because I was able to do the job. So whether or not there was something at play in terms of me coming with a different identity than maybe the other people who worked there and bringing more diversity to the table, I still got there because I did stuff to make it happen, right? I wasn't just sitting at home on my couch and somebody came in and brought me to an interview. I made it happen. So that's the idea of asset evaluation. And then barriers are manageable, although we know that they're sometimes not manageable or they're not fixable. But in many places, there are barriers that we can manage when we work together as a team, when we work in advocacy, when we address them, when we talk about them, when we self-advocate, when we advocate for others. Whereas succumbing is, well, if I accomplish something, it's just going to be, it's not as good as normal standards, or would have been for a lot of times for people who are still grieving the acquirement of a disability might say, well, it's not as good as it could have been before I acquired this disability. And barriers are at the forefront. Again, I think like anything, we always have to consider that someone might be grieving an acquired disability. Somebody might have very insurmountable barriers. And so I'm not at all saying we should sit down with people and say, well, here's what you should be doing. You should be coping. But I think it provides a valuable framework to think about the ways in which we can talk about adaptation to disability. Okay, so barriers. When you're coping, a person might consider the ways in which I always don't like the phrase when people say they're living with a disability, because like we're all living, everybody's living, everyone's alive, who's alive is living, but a person is living with the barriers that might be presented to them because of their disability and reducing limitations in the way that they can control. So even if the restaurant isn't accessible to me, I might then write a Google review and talk about like what a disappointment this is, and other people will see it, right? That's not necessarily changing anything, but it's maybe choosing a way I can control it, and then finding another restaurant and hyping them up because they're accessible and they're delicious, right? And so things like that. So working to eliminate barriers where you can, accommodate for the things that you need accommodations for. Sometimes people might use medical procedures. People who have chronic pain, there might be medical procedures that help with that, right? When you think about somebody who's experiencing major depression, they might find that there's a medication that actually helps with symptoms, and others might find that the medication doesn't help, or they choose a different route. So ways we cope. Assistive technology, of course, and learning new skills. And then succumbing is, the idea is the only way to reduce my barriers is to not have a disability, or to act like it doesn't exist or resign myself to it. And so one of the things I do love about ARCA and the work we do is that people talk about disability. Nobody, we are a group of people who talk about disability, and we don't talk about it in a way that so many were socialized to, where we don't talk about it and we act like it doesn't exist or it's something shameful, but that this is part of the human experience, right? So again, just a framework to consider. And then finally, a note about coping versus succumbing. I think it's really important that we look out for some of the terrible stumbling blocks that people with disabilities often have to deal with: inspiration and pity, right? So when we think about someone who is coping with the barriers put in front of them, that the inaccessibility and things like that, and they're living a meaningful life, that we aren't saying, oh, I'm so inspired by you because you're living this life, because even though you have a disability, right? There's a great TED Talk by someone named Stella Young, where she talks about inspiration. She calls it inspiration porn, where people are like, oh, so inspiring. And she got an award when she was a young person for just like living her life, and her parents were like, what the heck, she didn't even do anything, she's just living her normal life, right? Like, why are we so inspired? Everyone has to do these things. And so look out for that and be really careful. Like, I'm super careful with the word inspired. When I tell someone they inspire me, I try very hard, and I'm sure I don't always do it right, but I try hard to check myself and make sure I'm not being inspired because someone has an identity that's marginalized and they're overcoming things, right? But to be inspired by someone truly because of who they are and what they make me feel as a person, right? So being careful about that, right? Just not telling someone they're so inspirational just because they're like living a life, right? We all are out here trying to live a meaningful life. And then the other side of that is pity, right? So if someone is struggling with the barriers that they're impacted with because of disability related barriers, or even to bring back our intersectionality, if someone's having a really difficult time coping with the way that they're being treated or the way that their family is treating them or the inaccessibility to them about their sexual gender identity, same thing, pity is not someone anybody ever wants. I know I shouldn't speak in extremes, but I feel fairly certain that generally most of us don't want to be pitied. We want empathy. We want compassion. We want sorrow with us when something is difficult, but we don't want to be pitied. Pity puts in mind that the person pitying you is in somehow a higher plane, and that doesn't feel good. And so look out for both of those things, even if you apply sort of the idea of the coping versus succumbing framework to how people can adjust and adapt to any adversity that they experience that you may be faced with. So Beatrice Wright did talk a lot about disability identity development. So in the 90s, she talked about the ways in which there is often ascribed to disability this fundamental negative bias, right? And so like, I always get mad when people say wheelchair bound. Nobody's bound to their wheelchair, right? Like people can get out of their wheelchairs. Nobody's bound. And so we talk about this, Dr. Hunter talked about this in terms of just using respectful language, right? And we know within the disability movement that some people like person first language and some people like disability first language, and that's okay. And that's where we can use cultural humility. We can say, like, I know I've heard, a lot about person first language. I've also heard a lot about disability first language. Like, what do you prefer? How do you want me to refer to you? Even better yet, just a wide open question, right? So again, the idea that, you can be a person who has a disability, but you also like may have a job or other roles in your life that's how you want to be seen. That's how you want to be described. Again, I talked about the spread effect. So the visible aspects of certain disabilities might lead people to identify this person with their disability identification when really they're not there for any reason because of that, right? Again, like Dr. Hunter talked about, a queer disabled person showing up to like a pride event who doesn't have access, people might look at their disability and make some assumptions about why they're there, right? And so we need to be able to understand that spread effect is real and none of us are immune to it. We all have bias, no matter how many identities that we hold that are marginalized or privileged, everyone has bias. And so being really careful ourselves about the spread effect and making assumptions about people because of visible characteristics you see about them. Again, I talked about coping versus succumbing, and Beatrice Wright also talked about the importance of language. And so again, asking questions like, do you have a partner or a spouse rather than do you have a husband or a wife, right? And so those kinds of things can make a person feel affirmed for who they are and asking open questions. So this is just a by no means an exhaustive list, but this is a really great table that I've liked that was put together by the Transgender Training Institute, just about the ways in which we think about gender identity, gender expression, biological sex and sexual orientation. We all know sexual orientation and gender identity are conflated. Sexual orientation and just sex are conflated all the time, right? I imagine that, people often make sexual orientation about sex when relationships of all different types have no more or less to do with the actual act of sex than others. So that's really important. Those kinds of things are really important to consider. And then I love Venn diagrams. The other day I made a Venn diagram just for fun of ketchup, barbecue sauce. And then I live in Milwaukee, and our Milwaukee Brewers Stadium has a condiment called Secret Stadium Sauce. So I made a Venn diagram of those three condiments just to amuse myself. This is a Venn diagram, again, by no means exhaustive, but just to think about how the ways in which the intersection of disability and sexual identity, if there are visibility markers, now sexual identity doesn't in and of itself have a visibility marker, but some people might wear a symbol, and disability has a visibility. Gender identity as well has visibility mark, or not, I should say gender identity, assumed gender has visibility markers, right? So those things overlap where people make assumptions about what they can see. Disability and gender identity can both be declared or assumed at birth, and a person as they grow can really kind of take control of the way they see themselves in terms of both their gender identity and their disability identity. Gender identity and sexual identity are both sexualized by people and conflated. And then in the middle, I have all of these things carry labels that both people can confer upon themselves and other people may choose to confer upon them. But all three of these things are politicized. All of these things are pathologized. And all of these things can be seen as a point of identity pride. So I just like the ways in which these things overlap, kind of brings us back to our intersectionality idea and closer to what Dr. Lund has to share with us. So again, affirmative identity, affirmative therapy, celebrate who your client is, whoever they tell you that they are, and whoever you get to know them as your relationship with them grows. Be an anti-oppressive therapist by really doing your work, being aware of your own bias and your own shortcomings, and really just being able to admit that you have them, right? If you go in as a therapist and you act like you don't have any bias or you don't have any shortcomings, that's not going to come across as well to your clients as if you're honest about things you don't know. I think we see ignorance as a bad word, but ignorance is really just what we don't know. And if I'm willing to admit my ignorance, I think it looks a lot better than when I just show up as ignorant and I'm not willing to admit it, right? Be culturally responsive, whatever that means for your clients. Be curious about them. So again, those assumptions we all make, don't make them out loud. You make them in your head. We're all going to do that, but like then ask open, curious questions. The skills we learn as counselors and other professionals are skills we can use for all of the clients we work with, whatever their intersecting identities are. And then there's, of course, the really important identity that we hold as counselors as also being social justice advocates. And so with that, I think that's a really great place to turn it over to Emily, or to Dr. Lund, excuse me.
Thank you. I'll be talking about disability justice and how intersectionality ties into that, and particularly how the intersectionality of LGBT plus identity and disability ties into that. A bit about my positionality. I'm white, non-binary, female appearing. I have a physical disability, a lifelong physical disability, cerebral palsy, and I'm also gay and Jewish. So what is disability justice? Disability justice really represents the idea of true access, equality, and acceptance with disability. It goes behind just accommodation and tolerance. As many of you know, oftentimes when we talk about disability, we get stuck on, okay, what are the reasonable accommodations? What the bare minimum I need to do to not get sued? Like, how little can I get away with? And disability justice says, no, we have to go beyond that. We have to go beyond the bare minimum and really truly tackle and dismantle ableism at the personal, interpersonal, and systemic level. And just disability doesn't represent the goal of and the movement toward a truly anti-ableist world, not just a world where disabled people are tolerated or kind of sometimes acknowledged or given a limited set of accommodation, but truly a world in which people with disabilities are seen as equal and important and given full access. So what might that look like? For one thing, in disability justice, accessibility should be a full-line consideration in development, and accommodation are given fully and freely as needed. Oftentimes we're talking with someone about program development, about a program or policy or initiative about, and you have that disability, like, oh, we'll think about that in some for accommodation maybe. And it's really not a frontline consideration. It's not something most people think about until it's a problem, and then it's like, what the bare minimum we can do to address this, or are we just gonna not address it all? And then in disability justice framework, accessibility at the forefront, it at the groundwork of all the planning you do, the groundwork of the development, and then also accommodation are provided without protest, without gatekeeping, without a lot of barriers. And systemic ableism is identified and dismantled in social structured programming practices. It requires kind of a deep routing at what are the assumptions, what are the kind of building blocks in the program, and how are they built with able assumption or able effects, and then how can we dismantle them and rebuild them. For example, one thing that may come up in the idea of grandfather building, basically your building is old enough or historic enough, you can argue against modification for accessibility. And from a disability point of view, you might look at that and say, well, that's promoting inaccessibility. It's saying accessibility only mattered in certain spaces, and that you want to access an old building and you can't give disability out of luck. So disability at that point might be looking at how do we make the places accessible? How do we work to maintain their historical significance while also increasing accessibility? Access to resources and support is available to all people and needed. We know a lot of resources people with disability need are oftentimes expensive, and oftentimes limited by the structure and by the social structure they have in place. Healthcare and the caught on that is a really good example of that. Add a thing like access to technology, mobility aids. A wheel insurance company may only approve you for a wheelchair every 5 years, even if it's broken, even if your kid had grown out it 2 years ago, even if it no longer meets your needs. And I know disability adjustment model really focused on getting people what they need when they need it, and not so much the red tape, but well, do you really need this, or are you willing to pay enough to provide you with this? And it's important to know in disability literature, internalized and interpersonal ableism are recognized and deconstructed. People oftentimes carry a lot of internal biases, even if they're a member of that group. So even if you're someone with disability, you can really well internalize a lot of ableism from the ableist messaging around us. And you can carry that forward in ways we see like the hierarchy of disabilities. When people with some type of disability are seen a better, and people with other type of disability are seen a lesser than. And things like that would be addressed by tackling internalized ableism and tackling the way in which people with disability can still enact ableism. And in addition, a lot of people with disabilities are actively involved in projects and initiatives, and their input is recognized, respected, valued, and used. I do a lot of community-based participatory research, which involve individuals from the community researching, being involved really from the ground up, from conceptualization to dissemination. And oftentimes I talk to the researcher like, oh, I want to do community-based participatory research, CPPR, will you help? And I'm like, yeah, sure. And they're like, so we all decide what we're gonna do, and we want a group of disabled people to tell us what a great idea this is, and how, our idea is perfect, and we can't really make modifications because we're on a timeline. So we really just need to tell them how great what we're doing is. And I would have to say, I'm sorry, but we're not CPPR. You're really not involving the community directly in research. You're just acting to tell you after the fact that your plan is great, even if it had issued accessibility barriers, a would component to it. So that part about making sure disabled voices and disabled input is truly valued is very critical. Ableism in language is recognized, accepted, and corrected. We talked a bit about that with the various type language usually for this before. And also the number of ableist tone we use as insults, and we use as way to discredit or dehumanize someone. really need to be dissected and addressed. Some examples that might be like the term SPAD, particularly in the UK context, which means spastic, but it's used as an insult. Terms like moron, idiot, were all originally used to refer to people with disabilities and are now used as general insults. So that awareness of the ableism embedded in our language and kind of rooting that out and understanding it. And then people with disabilities are given full access to meaningful education and employment. And the reason I say meaningful here is we had a bad habit of historic in the field, and so they kind of assuming anyone with disability can only do and should only do like sheltered work, maybe minimal level social work in the community. And we don't a lot of them do a good job of looking at what do you want to do, like what would you actually enjoy doing for 40 hours a week, and really making sure people can spend the night doing things they enjoy that are meaningful to them. Another component occurs to that people with disabilities have access to accessible and high quality healthcare. We know there's a lot of able in healthcare and in medicine. And there's, for example, the issue of diagnostic overshadowing, where a physician may see you have a visible disability and say, oh, you know, everything you're experiencing must be due to that and not doing any more tests. Or they may see that someone has a diagnosis of a psychiatric disability or mental illness in their chart and say, oh, you know, all the psychosomatic or go to anxious. So I'm not going to do any further testing. I'm not going to look into any further. And a lot of time we know, unfortunately, it can lead to diagnosis being delayed or missed and potentially causing unnecessary suffering and loss of life. So that type of dismantling of ableism in the medical system also part of disability justice. So you may look at it and say, okay, all that sounds great, but you know, we had a long way to go. We had a long way to go to do any one of those things, much less all of them. Like that is tough hill to climb. And yeah, it is. No one who's working this way, this just saying we're going to get there overnight. We're going to wake up tomorrow and everything going to be accessible, and everyone will have confronted their internal and interpersonal with them, and we'll all have access to truly accessible disability culture, competent healthcare, and people with disability will be fully employed in jobs they enjoy. We all know it's a movement and it's a struggle, but the idea of disability is that we keep that continued focus on progress. We keep moving forward. We don't say, okay, we can just have a little ableism in the tweet. We're constantly confronting it and constantly looking at how can we change it, even if it's slow, even if it's incremental, even if it takes a lot of time. Then that goal of constant progress and constant movement. Progress toward disability is continuous and responsive, meaning it responds to the need in the community. For example, during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw issues with healthcare rationing, with ventilator rationing in a lot of states and countries. And thankfully, we were able to get policy initiatives that challenged that and revolt that fairly quickly. But that because the disability community spoke up. Advocates jumped on it, they immediately realized it was an issue. They did a lot of really important advocacy, public programming, working with national, international agencies to address that. So disability justice is responsive to what needs and what is happening in the community. And ultimately, disability justice is really based on the deep belief in the irrevocable humanity and value of disabled lives. So intersectionality, which you talked about a bit earlier, is really key to disability justice. Disability justice had for a very long time had a deeply intersectional focus because it had that deep value on human life and human dignity. And again, as we discussed earlier, intersectionality was first articulated as a concept, but of course it had been around, it always been around. It was first articulated a concept by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And it referred to the concept that people's brilliant identity intersect each other to produce unique experiences. And Crenshaw's original work went on the intersectionality at race, with specifically blackness and gender. So under an intersection framework, we might realize Black women and girls have different experiences that are neither shared by non-Black women and girls or by Black boys and men. Because of that intersection of race and gender, it produces unique experiences that aren't shared by people that hold one of the identities. So what happens when you don't have an intersection framework? Because honestly, we usually don't. And intersectionality is entering the conversation more and more, but we still have a lot of progress to make before we integrate that. What happens is we often look siloing aspects of some identity. So we say, okay, this is your gender, this is your race, this is your religion, this is your disability, and never do they interact. You only get one identity at a time. In one article I read that highlighted the excellently was a study by Whitefoot and Williams, who interviewed disabled people of color about their experiences of getting services, getting help after experiencing domestic violence. And a participant overwhelmingly reported that they will basically act to choose one. When they sought services, well, you can have culturally and racially competent services, or you can have disability competent accessible services. Like, pick one, you can't both. And Dr. Hunter mentioned earlier, we often sometimes hear things that we don't need to discuss LGBTQ topics in the disability space, or we don't need to discuss disability topic in the LGBTQ space. So then again, idea you only get one identity at a time, you have to pick one. And what it does is end up rating the unique needs and experiences, especially in people with multiple model identities, and not recognizing them. For example, in that Whitefoot and Williams people I mentioned earlier, there were participants who were Black and deaf, and they reported difficulty finding interpreters who were fluent and could understand and sign in Black Sign Language. Because we know from the history of segregation, Black Sign Language is very distinct in a lot of ways from mainstream ASL. And because providers weren't willing to see that intersectionality between race and disability, they weren't able to provide for that need or recognize it. So with intersectionality, people are really aroused and encouraged to discuss the totality of their lived experience. They can discuss their experience, for example, as a Black disabled man, and a Jewish disabled non-binary person, and not for the need to separate out, okay, this is my disability part, this is my Jewish part, this is my part of the man. You can really discuss the totality of your experience and the way in which their identities influence each other. And private services offer programs and services that address the unique needs and multi-marginalized people in the community. So there are resources that say specifically serve the need of the Black deaf community or of the transgender disabled community, and there are available resources that are focused on those intersectionalities and understanding them and providing that intersectionally confident care. And I call it multiple ways that intersectionality should be acknowledged. We know that we don't get two identities. We aren't just moving from siloing one identity to siloing two. That people had multiple identities and they all interact. So like, for example, being able to discuss how race and sexuality and disability all intersect in one, and that multiple intersections influence your experiences and produce a unique experience is a really important part of intersectionality. So, what are some examples of intersectionality applied to disability and LGBTQ plus identity? A big one is sexual education that doesn't solely assume heterosexuality. It offers people with disabilities. We know sexual education is often lacking in general for all people with disabilities. And then what we see increasingly is that when it is offered, it assumes every single person with disability is heterosexual and cisgender. I remember I was once chatting with someone consulting a bit about program they were doing for sexuality with youth with disabilities and youth without disabilities. And they were talking how their program for youth without disability included a lot of stuff on like queer identities, non-heterosexual relationships, things like that. And I said, oh, that's great. So I'm assuming you had that same content in the program for youth with disabilities. And they're like, oh no, we think it would confuse them. So we're just leaving it out and focusing, on the heterosexual relationship. And I said, there's likely going to be some people in that room with disabilities who aren't heterosexual. And you need to provide education for them as well as for the heterosexual participant with disability. Ableism and homophobia and transphobia are acknowledged and addressed within communities. Sometimes the marginalized community was so focused on our own experience, our own focus, our own experiences, a thing like ableism, homophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, etc., that we kind of don't want to discuss or don't see our own biases or the own ways in which we enact prejudice and systemic and interpersonal discrimination. So under intersectional disability framework, you really address that when someone in an LGBTQ plus space says something able, we acknowledge it and call out and address it. When someone in the disability community make homophobic or transphobic remarks, or had a policy that intentionally or unintentionally perpetuate heterosexism and cisgender, we are able to acknowledge that and address it, and really being able to address our own biases within the marginalized community. And the spirit health outcome, the social outcome for queer disabled people addressed. Often the research on health disability in particular is still very siloed. You'll find a lot of people talking about health disability in the queer community, a lot of people talking about health disability in the disabled community, but much of it won't focusing on health disability for people who are both disabled and queer. And then queerness and disability are both acknowledged and narrated about LGBT plus disabled people. Again, a lot of times when we're talking about the stories of multi-marginalized people, we still that siloing effect. We still had, okay, this is Pride Month, so tell me the experience of being queer, and if someone bring up the experience of being disabled, like, oh no, don't mention that. We're focusing on the queer side. And being able to acknowledge that intersectional identity and experiences is really critical. So there are quite some barrier to this. Like, this is a challenging thing to do. Again, not something we're going to do overnight. We know that a lot, both external and internalized ableism and homophobia and transphobia. And it's important to know also the internalized aspect of that just because you have a disability or have a queer identity doesn't mean you hadn't perhaps internalized some of that messaging that ableist, homophobic, transphobic messaging, and those are still things you may believe or enact that you need to cope and work through, and potentially, if you're in the counseling mode, help your client recognize and work through them. There's a relative lack of resources and discussion. Again, I'm always happy for moving forward in the discussion or having the webinar, but a lot of people are still really stuck in that single action siloed mindset, and a lot of resources are still really focused exclusively on one aspect identity. And then a relative lack of research, and part of it can be the difficulty in when you're looking at multiple object communities. A lot of times you don't have a big enough sample set of data. So like, oh, we don't have enough people to look at the intersection between sex, minority identity, and disability. So we're just not going to do it. And it comes up again and again. You don't have a large sample size. So like, oh, we still can't do it. So it seems like deliberate oversampling people at multiple identities. Like Dr. Hunter said, deliberately focusing on those intersecting research and making those intersecting a key part of recruitment. All that stuff is really critical because we don't know, we don't know. We don't know, we don't measure, we don't know what we don't look at in research. So it's really important to do those things to make sure that people are represented in data and all represented in the information we share and the story we tell. It also can be a lot of pressure to hide identity. We often end up being qualitative in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity, but people can be qualitative in other aspects. People can be qualitative in their disability, particularly in their invisible disability. They can really struggle with, do I tell people, do I disclose? What are the cons? What are the consequences they potentially they call me? And also, what are the consequences of me staying qualitative or continuing not to disclose? Because there are real consequences to that as well. It causes a lot of psychological stress and a lot of difficulty for people. So, choosing not to disclose or choosing to stay in the closet, while it can be a valid choice, is not a choice without consequences or cost, and it can be important to explore both sides of that to help your client make a decision that works for them. We also know the compounded intersectional bigotry and discrimination, and also tokenism. To give you an example, I was in a meeting a couple of years ago on a topic regarding diversity, and someone said, "Oh, they're Dr. One. They represent the disability perspective." And because it would fun, I also said, "Oh, and I'm also represent." I remember that community, and they said, "Oh no, you're a disabled person, so that's your perspective." And like, well, okay, I guess I am your token disabled person to the meeting, but okay. So how can we promote intersectional disability judgment? Remember that each person is the expert on their own identity and experiences. A lot of times we can get in the habit of looking at demographics and saying, "Oh, I know your identity, I know your experiences." And that can lead us to miss out on things because people weight the experiences differently. People may prioritize or deprioritize certain identities in certain contexts. A great example that I like to give is I have a good friend of mine whose father is a Mexican immigrant, her mother is a German immigrant, and she grew up in San Francisco. So she grew up trilingual, speaking Spanish, English, and German. And because she was visibly Hispanic, a lot of times people rightfully assume she can speak Spanish. And I was in a meeting home where someone was bragging like they spoke all the languages, and like, "Oh, I speak German." She's like, "Oh, I do too," and started speaking in German, and they were caught completely off guard because she didn't look like what we might stereotypically think a German speaker looked like. So it's always important to act out people identity who they are in their story rather than assuming you know it because you saw what demographic box they checked. And it's really important to call out ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and other bigotry, especially when you're in a position of power or position of privilege. Use that power to call out those things, to make them known, because otherwise they just are perpetuated in our systems and they go unchecked and they continue to be embedded in them. Recognize that identity development is a process. Just because you have a client now and when they come in, they maybe are still grappling with their disability identity, their sexuality, their gender identity. Maybe at the time they identify still as able-bodied, heterosexual, and over the course of working, and they may come to kind of own being disabled and queer, and their identity development may change over time. It's not static, and it can grow and change and be one more that and also tackle on internalized biases. Recognizing knowledge, feeling, and feeling, including one resulting from intersect identities. And Dr. Hunter said there can be real cost to being known as someone who's disabled, as someone who's queer, and people may hide their identity or conceal them in certain cases and in certain situations for really good and valid reason, and it's important to kind of discuss and dissect them and talk about, that process of when do you want to conceal it? Do you want to conceal it? How do you want to handle disclosure so they can make kind of their own informed decisions? But you should never downplay or dismiss someone really real concerned about the consequences of being seen at or being known as a member of the marginalized group. And then again, put intersectionality and accessibility at the forefront in planning and development. Again, building it from the ground up, not saying, oh, we'll do this and then we'll tack this on later or someone else. Really building into the code what you're doing is important.
I think we are very much at time. We had some discussion questions for you all, but I think, are you guys sharing these slides with everyone, Danielle?
Yes, if you all might be able to send us a copy of the slides, we would happily send that to everybody.
Okay. We have some, yeah, so you can think about those later, but yeah. And I'll stop sharing. I know people have questions, but I also know we're at time.
Yeah, so if it might be okay with our presenters, what we could do is we could go ahead and we can conclude today's webinar, but if you all might be open to staying on for just a few additional minutes, then anyone who has questions can ask you all, and otherwise, they can go ahead and email each of you as well.
If people have questions.
Wonderful. So at this point, for those who would like to ask questions directly to our presenters, please feel free to stay on. But of course, first and foremost, we would like to provide just our sincerest gratitude to Dr. Kriofske, Mainella, Dr. Lund, and Dr. Hunter for this wonderful and meaningful presentation on disability at the intersection, disability, LGBTQIA plus pride, identity, and service. Dr. Kriofske, Mainella, Dr. Lund, and Dr. Hunter, we're most grateful for each of you for taking the time to share with us here today. For those in attendance, we also appreciate you joining us today, and we would like to invite you to save the date for our next ARCA webinar as part of our month-long June 2024 webinar series, which is scheduled for next Friday, June 14th, from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, titled 10 Keys to Creating Inclusive, Accessible, and Engaging Services for Youth. Please be sure to review our month-long June 2024 webinar series program to sign up for the remaining webinars each Friday of this month. More information can be found about these different programs in the chat box. And of course, we hope you'll consider joining us. And on behalf of the American Rehabilitation Counseling Association, we wish each of you a happy Pride, and we thank all of you again and wish all of you a wonderful weekend ahead. Thank you all so very much.